a shout out to Scott Berry from Vanderbilt, Elaine Kim from Colorado State, Ellen Leidenheim from Johns Hopkins, and Eva McGee from Charles Drew for kind of working with us and helping us through alpha testing. So we have probably maybe one, maybe two more rounds of kind of development and testing before we complete this phase. So we're really getting close to wrapping up our alpha testing phase. So we don't have time today to do any sort of demo, but I did want to give everybody just a sneak peek at kind of what we have been developing over the past year. So the screenshots that you see on our slide here are from our test site. So this image on the left is just the homepage. So this is what users will see when they first log into the CUSP site. And so I'll just have kind of a brief welcome message and some basic instructions on how to use the site. Down below will be kind of the meat and potatoes. So this is where we have all the procedures that are located in the site and then various tools that the user can use to interact with that data. So there'll be a free search text option as well as some pick lists that are currently under development. But those pick lists will kind of work like online shopping, where you can pick characteristics or attributes that are of interest to you, such as maybe a species or a type of procedure, and that can help the users whittle down what will potentially be a lot of information into something very much more manageable rather quickly. And then on the right here, we just have an example of what a procedure record will look like, an example of the type of information that users will be able to find on the site. So in this particular example, we just have a procedure for euthanasia of a rabbit. So up at the top, we just have basic demographic information about that procedure, including the name, the type, species, who within the, or I guess which institution contributed that site or that procedure to the site. And then in the body of that procedure, there's just a very simple description of how that agent is prepared and then administered to the animal, including details such as the route of administration and the dose. And then at the bottom, each procedure record will also include a keywords field and a substance type field. And so these actually will kind of feed into those search features that I had mentioned before and help users be able to identify procedures that are of interest to them much more quickly. I also just want to give a little plug. We'll have a session at the upcoming ALAS meeting where we will be doing a demo of this site. So if you're intrigued and want to learn more or see more, definitely tune in. That's going to be on August 26th, bright and early at 8 a.m. Eastern. Let's see. So next step. So as I had mentioned, we're taking a pretty standard approach to software testing. We're currently in the alpha phase. We're anticipating that we'll be able to start beta testing shortly, hopefully coming up here in October. And that phase of testing will really be focused more on just how information gets out of the site. So how do you download that information and consume it at your own institution? This phase will also again be focused on the technical side of things. So we're really looking for bugs and other technical other issues that would prevent release to a larger audience. We are going to include a larger number of testers for that round as well, just to make sure that we just have a broader set of eyes on things. Following beta testing, we will then move on to pilot testing. And this will be kind of that last phase of testing before we release the site to a larger audience. And this will really focus more on qualitative aspects of the site, such as, is the system user-friendly, as we were hoping to build? Is it actually saving people time and reducing burden as we had hoped? So that we have planned. I'm hopeful that we can still squeeze that in the last quarter of this year, but we'll see how that goes. And then following that, we will open the site up to FDP institutions first. That'll happen sometime in Q1 of next year, which still, that's a really large number of institutions. I think with phase 7, those new members, we're up to about 200 or so institutions that'll have access right away, which is amazing and fantastic. And then our ultimate goal is to open the site up to everybody. So whether you're an FDP member or not an FDP member. So that'll happen sometime in 2021. So in preparation, while we're kind of wrapping up alpha phase, we've been prepping for the beta testing phase. And so we've identified our testers. So just a shout out to those wonderful people for the time that they're going to be dedicating here soon to helping us get the site up and running. So we have Stuart Bear from the University of Virginia, Madeline Buddha from the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences, Steve Crowley from Harvard, Viola Devine from Penn State. Eva McGee came back for a second round. She's from Charles Drew. Melanie Lucas is also from Penn State. Nick Newfinch from Harvard. Rachel Panis and April Ripka, both from Penn State. Carrie Roberto from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and Cindy Rosenblatt from the Medical University of South Carolina. And so our testers, we've completed training with all of them, so they know what our process is and just how we're tracking work. Additionally, we have gone through and revised our testing plan just based on feedback from testers during the alpha phase of testing thus far, and we're in the process of just reviewing our test cases and updating them as needed. We're also going to use our beta testing phase to collect additional feedback that should be helpful for implementation, such as developing FAQs. So those beta testers will hopefully give us feedback on what sort of information would be helpful as they're first learning the site and kind of navigating the site, so that hopefully we can be better prepared whenever we open it up to a larger audience. And then in addition to just kind of the development and testing work, if you remember from May, we had recently switched to more of a steering committee style of leadership and reorganized the working group into 4 new teams that would help to better support the project as we move towards implementation. So we now have an education and outreach team, which is being led by Scott Burry from Vanderbilt and Michelle Brott from the University of Washington. A help desk team, which is being led by Elaine Kim from Colorado State and April Ripka from Penn State. Quality control team, which is led by Eva McGee from Charles Drew and Cindy Rosenblatt from Medical University of South Carolina, and a technical systems team, which is being led by Jarrett Langston from University of Alabama, Birmingham. And so far we've been able to develop and finalize a charter for the steering committee, and that just kind of outlines the purpose of that committee, how it'll function, how membership and stuff will rotate over time. We're also currently working on updating the CUSP page within the FDP site so that it's more up to date. It'll eventually include FAQs and other helpful tips to kind of connect new users to the CUSP site and just kind of outline the processes that we'll use to do that. I know the education outreach team is also actively gathering information on both national and kind of regional or local meetings that we could use, I guess, as a way to promote CUSP and just to share with the community that this tool is out there, and kind of just keep them informed if they want to join. And then lastly, we've been working really just to develop the underlying infrastructure that will support the site once it goes live. So we've been developing various business processes and this related supporting materials that will help to onboard new institutions or to review flag procedures. We've also been drafting kind of the content for the help page for new users. So this includes things like a data dictionary, as well as user definitions, FAQs, that sort of thing. And so that's all that I had for an update this morning. I'm happy to take any questions now, or we can hold questions to the end. Either is fine. Let's see, I think there was one question in the chat. It says, can you share which institutions are in each stage of development? So right now the site is, there's no institution that's kind of officially part of the CUSP site. The site itself is just under development. We have, I guess, sort of dummy users kind of in the site right now for testing that just helps us to evaluate if certain features are working as intended. But eventually we'll have institutions join the site. That'll happen during kind of the pilot phase and that initial go live phase. And then we're also have a question about, will only FDP member institutions be able to join, or any institution? So our ultimate goal is to have any institution be able to join the CUSP site. Initially, access will be limited to FDP members, just because we've been doing this project with FDP, and they've been doing a lion's share of the development work. But our ultimate goal, though, is to open it up to everybody. But we're still kind of working out the details of how and when that'll happen. Is there going to be a cost associated? At this time, no. There should be no cost associated with using this tool. Okay, were there any other questions? Let's see. Nope, it doesn't look like it. Perfect. Well, if anything else comes up, please feel free to either chat with me privately, or we can answer them at the end, or we can send me an email. That would be fine too. I can leave my email in the chat, and I'll hand it over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. Good morning, friends, colleagues. My name is Bill Greer. I currently work at the University of Michigan, and my partner in crime for this Universal Protocol Template project is Ron Banks, and many of you who we have drafted in to help us. So Ron and I are going to go through a series of slides. I'm going to start out by trying to give you an update or a background on where we started and where we are. And it brings me to the, to the discussion points. We want to make sure everyone's up to date. It may be the first time that you've heard about the Universal Protocol Template. I know webinars are giving a lot of us opportunities to participate in sessions that we haven't been able to participate in the past. So again, I'm going to give you an idea of the project summary, the goals of the Universal Template. We're going to talk about some of the history as far as community input. Then I want to get to the status, where we currently are, give you an idea of next steps, some timelines, and then point 7, just kind of an outline of the protocol. At that point, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, and Ron's going to get into some very specific questions and give you guys an idea of how the template's going to work and the goals of the overall template. So let's start with a little bit of history. So the IACUC Administrators Association, it was a group that Ron and I founded in about 15 years ago, 2006, something like that. And over the years, we have been working with the IACUC administrative community on various best practices and projects. Probably around 2017, the idea came up that a protocol template, a universal template, may be beneficial for the community. And that kind of coincided with the Cures Act. So at that time, we were all thinking maybe this is a good time to work with OLAW, the USDA, and amongst our community to think about what a protocol template could look like. In other words, what can we develop for the IACUC administrators, the IACUC, and most importantly, the PIs, to make this form as with the least administrative and compliance burden as possible, and yet allow it to be functional for the IACUC to do its reviews of the animal activities and for us to meet the regulatory compliance needs and ensure the welfare of all the animals. So to give you an idea, what we did was we tailored it to the species that are most commonly used. In other words, mice and rats. That doesn't mean that it only works for mice and rats. According to Neighbor, about 95% of the protocols that are out there and the research that's going on involves rodents, i.e. mus and rattus. So one of the things we wanted to do here was to capitalize on some of the standardized procedures. And this is where we're hoping, as we bring this to fruition, and we work with Aubrey and Sally, that we can start looking at how some of the CUSP procedures work and get them to work into this template. Again, it's going to be up to the institutions how they want to use this, and I'll get to a little bit of that downstream. One of the main points is we want this template to only include the information the IACUC needs to do the review of the animal activities. So we don't want to gather a bunch of minutia that really the committee doesn't need or doesn't use. The other idea is to provide as much information as possible to the PIs using checkboxes, and we'll give you a couple of examples when I get downstream to Ron, and he'll show you exactly what we're talking about. Finally, we want to keep it simple and user-friendly. We want to make sure that you know, when an IACUC member reviews it, it's very straightforward. It's easy to understand. When a PI fills it out, same deal. Easy to use, easy to complete, and importantly, they can share it with their lab, with the other people that are doing the animal activities, and it's easy to follow, so they can ensure they're maintaining compliance with their protocol form. So I want to give a quick disclaimer. You know, once this UPT is finalized and made available, we're going to make it available, through OLAW and the IAA website. Primarily, it's going to replace a document that's on OLAW's website that Dr. Wolf years ago developed, and really we found this as an opportunity to update that. So we've been working closely with OLAW, Dr. Brown is the director, and members of her team to make sure that we can make the most user-friendly project possible. But it's very important for me to say that once this template is done and it is available through OLAW or IAA or wherever you may grab it, it's not a mandated document. You're not going to be required to use this downstream. It truly is another resource that we're just trying to make available. You may already have a well-defined system that uses an electronic template that your institution just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on. This is not an attempt to replace anything like that. It just isn't going to be a resource for you, your office, your team to consider some of the things that truly are needed by the IACUC to do its review. Important to say this has been a team effort. We started the discussions about the UPT at least 10 years ago, and at that particular time, there was a lot of angst and a lot of pushback because the idea was that institutions' research portfolios and species they use are so different that it's unlikely we could ever come up with a template that could be functional for all. So as we continue to chat about this over the years, when we got around, as I said, to 2017, 2018, the idea came to fruition and we started thinking about it more. We used the document that OLAW had on its website as a resource, and we spent meeting time in 2017 and 2018 to talk about and go through the existing document. We used it to identify particular questions that are absolutely necessary for IACUCs to do their job, and other questions that may be covered somewhere else. For example, rodent surveillance and various things that may be part of a veterinary care program and not necessarily need be included in a protocol template form. Initially, 2017 and 18, this was an IAA initiative, and we worked a lot to come up with a draft of the document. Around 2019, last year, we maybe the end of 2018, we partnered with FDP and suggested that we make this an official project for them, and they agreed. They want to work with us and work with the OLAW and USDA and other members of our community to bring together some sort of document that gets to the points that we need to cover as far as the review of animal activities, but does it in a way that we're not creating unnecessary burden for PIs. We have an FDP working group. Many in that group are very engaged in offering comments on various sections of the document along the way. We have other members of the group that are waiting for the document to be complete and just want to do user testing and will provide us input once the document is finished. To give you an idea what we've done thus far is we've just sent out various sections of the document for each of us on the working group to consider. and dig deep into the questions and think about, you know, the relevance to animal care and use and the relevance to animal activities, collating all of that into one final document, which we will share back to our working group and then eventually to the community for user input. Let's see. So what progress have we made to date? So we do have a draft template that, again, was developed through IAA, and that is the one I talked about we did in 2017, 2018. That's the form that we brought to our FDP working group, and we're working on it to enhance, refine, change, and further develop. One of the things that we've done is we've broke the document down into various sections, and we'll have a slide on that in a second to give you an idea of our thought process. Sections have already been provided to subcommittee members. We've gathered comments, and we've collated all those comments, and we've included them into the initial draft of the universal template. So the next steps, again, once the draft is completed, then we'll be providing it to the entire subcommittee members. We're still kicking around some questions basically on the use of biohazards. Ron will hit this a bit later on, but it's a challenge because the IACUC doesn't really do the risk assessment for biohazards, but the IACUC has some responsibility as it relates to occupational health and safety. So do we gather information in the template relative to the risk assessments? We don't know. So we're still talking about that. And these are the kind of things that we kick back and forth as a group. So once this document is completed and the subcommittee comments and concerns are all addressed, then what we want to do is some user testing. Obviously, we want to make sure this document works, first of all, for the researchers. When a researcher reads the question, do they understand the information that's being asked? Does it make sense? We need to make sure that from a veterinarian standpoint, that this document has all the issues a veterinarian needs to understand the complications associated with any animal activities, so that they can have a plan to work with the PIs or to oversee, train, or care for any animals that are involved in an animal activity. The IACUC administrators, you'll see there are some things that the IACUC administrators specifically take care of, and they will need to be able to gather certain information. Again, limited. There are some cases from a compliance perspective, the only way we're going to get the information is from the PI. So we will have a few of those questions in here, but you know, we want to try to limit that and minimize it. And then finally, we want to make sure this document is easy for IACUC members to review, that they're comfortable that they're getting the information they need, and they're comfortable that they know what's going on with all the animals and all the activities that are occurring. Finally, once we get through all the user testing, the document will become a resource for the community, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. You know, it may be something that you just want to adopt and use. It may be something that you use to tweak a current template that you're already using, or it just may be something that, again, serves as a reference and lets you know what we as a community feel like this protocol form needs to include. So just in brief, as we mentioned, we have a very large group working on this, and two of the primary committee members represent our regulators. So Dr. Axel Wolf is on our committee, and Axel is looking at it from an OLAW perspective. His concern will be to make sure that this document satisfies PHS requirements and anything else that are relevant to the guide and the PHS policy. Dr. Bob Gibbons is also part of our group, and Bob is looking at it from a USDA perspective, and he wants to make sure that the template is inclusive enough to ensure we're able to satisfy all of the concerns related to USDA Animal Welfare Act regulations and the associated species. So let me give you a quick overview of the timeline, then I will give you a quick look at the an outline, and then I'll turn it over to Ron to go through the some of the specific questions. Again, we'll entertain questions from you guys at the end, so please start kicking questions to us through the chat if you have any, and we'll be monitoring them along the way. So we started the year with great initiative, thinking that we would finish things up around, or at least be in user testing by December 2020. And that, you know, as it did at your institution, COVID slowed things down for us. We all had to divert our interest and attention away from some of the projects that we work on to issues at our own institutions. So we tried to keep things moving a bit. I would say we got probably 6 months behind with this. I wasn't able to keep up with getting things out to our committee. So we are just now getting back on track. The idea is that we still can get into user testing, but instead of being completed by December 2020, we want to start by December 2020 or January 2021. So our hopes is to have a document in final form by the end of this year so that we can start going through some user testing and get some input from all the members of the community that represent those areas we just talked about: veterinarians, IACUC, PIs, and IACUC administrators. So very quickly, we broke the template down into various sections: administrative information, species information, justification for animal use, some general animal activities. And this is something that we previously think of as the experimental design. Ron's going to get into this. And then some details and specifics about procedures. We have a section in here that we hope will allow us to identify departures and justifications to make it easy to query and keep track through electronic systems. And then again, the hazard use section, which we're still contemplating on and trying to figure out what to do there. And finally, some acknowledgements or some various points where we're asking for PI assurances and things like that. So with that, let me turn it over to Ron so he can get into the weeds of some of these questions, and then, as I said, toward the end, we'll get into some Q&A. So Ron.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, colleagues. Welcome from Flyover, USA. Blue skies, cool weather, little wind. It doesn't sound like Oklahoma, but by golly, it's wonderful. Wish you were here. And I was not inside. Let me start with a couple of comments that we've really got to consider if we're going to wrap our hands around this project, this UPT. First of all, a protocol. What is a protocol? Well, it's a beast we created. Our community created this. And as is often the case with any bureaucratic creation, the longer it exists, the fatter it gets. Bloated to a point on occasion, sometimes it's non-functional. One of the initiatives we're trying with the UPT is to refine and lose some of that bloat and get back to the specific questions necessary for specific issues. Back up one more slide, Bill. Let's stay on that first one there for a moment, please. Second note is that there's no such thing as zero risk in our world. And anyone who tries to build a protocol form that will give the institution zero risk will end up building a protocol form for the next 40 years. We just cannot get there. So what we need to be looking at is a situation of acceptable risk. What are the things we have to deal with, and what are the things we could deal with, and what are the things would be nice to deal with? But somewhere along that spectrum, we start losing true efficiency and operational functionality and getting things down the road. We start interfering with research outcomes. Thirdly, we need also to remember that the 8th edition of the guide made a dramatic shift for our community from an engineering-based sort of standard to a performance-based sort of standard. There are two portions of our community in general sense, and generalities, you know the risk with that still tend to rely more on engineering and less on performance. One of those being the IACUC and the protocol process. We tend to drive our questions from the standpoint of engineering, and we should be driving our questions more from the standpoint of performance. Many of us, our institutions, have over recent years given more flexibility within our protocol question, but the questions themselves still remain. Next, we need to recall that IACUC members make money when they're at the research bench. Now, you may pay your IACUC member a stipend to work on the committee, but that's not how they make real resources for the institution, nor how they advance biomedical research. So our goal is to keep the work of the IACUC for the scientist members, in fact, for all members, minimal, and utilize the skills of the IACUC administrators and support staff more maximally. Which brings in then the next point, the IACUC must have confidence on the IACUC admin staff to capture a lot of information that is institutionally necessary, but is not IACUC required for the IACUC to make an informed decision. Historically, we've gathered that information because we have not had either personnel, sufficient skills, or confidence in our IACUC administrators and IACUC support staff, but those conditions are and do need to change. And lastly, to reiterate a point Bill said a few moments ago, your institution may not fully engage the UPT in all of its glory, and that's fine. If your systems work, more power to you. But we may suggest an idea or two you might consider incorporating into your current systems. That then, as a background for diving in the weeds, the slide you see on the screen now is one that would be involved in the first section of the UPT, that is administrative information. And frankly, it's all things that are compliance related. Does the IACUC need to know the faculty status of the person submitting the protocol? Now, some would argue yes, because at our institution, only full faculty or tenured faculty or status faculty have the permissions to do a protocol, but that could be handled by an administrator well before it ever got to the IACUC for review. Why does the IACUC need to know the submitter's cell phone number? Certainly the administration needs to, that's going to manage the protocol. The compliance staff need to, but not necessarily for the IACUC. So the information might be gathered, but may not be necessary for IACUC submission on the protocol form. When we look at the next slide, we see some other items as well that are worth consideration. Advance, please, Bill. Bill, can you advance to the next slide, please? Oh,
Should
you are
see it,
there.
Ron.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
My screen's not is flickering and not doing well. When we get to other kinds of information that also could be in a compliance sort of context, the question becomes, is the IACUC required to see this when they submit the protocol form? Certainly the building and room number are necessary because an inspection team is going to have to go there. But is that part of the IACUC review process, and is it necessary? Information must be captured for management of the program, but is it necessary for the IACUC in its review process? There are some other items also that are appropriate for capture. Next slide, please. We want to be sure the research team understand what their obligations are, and instead of playing a cat and mouse game with them as they write a ton of narrative to see if they've infused the right phraseology or they've made the right statement, we can certainly gather up all of the admittances, all the acknowledgments into a single administrative section very much in the front that the IACUC would very rarely ever see. The institution needs to know all protocol participants' OC status, that is, that they are enrolled or they have issued the right documentation to bypass. They need to assure that training has been performed adequately. They need to understand that there is a compliance process and non-compliance has significant outcomes, that the veterinary staff is there to assist and not to interfere and can support them. How the amendment process works, that there are annual reports necessary, that protocols do not have an unending lifespan, at least for those that are PHS supported. And then lastly, veterinary authority. All of these things can be simple check boxes to eliminate the cat and mouse game and can be captured in the administrative information which the IACUC administrator uses. Next slide, please. Then we get into sections of information that might be a little bit more of interest and need for the IACUC to make an informed decision. And there will be several details that will be necessary, but some of the forms from some institutions may actually have more information than is really necessary for an informed decision and enough information to confuse what an informed decision ought to be. Point one, definitely we do need to know the species, since the IACUC must validate that appropriate species were used for the type of studies being conducted. For example, if the activities are being conducted in rats, it would it would be inappropriate for the researcher to be using swine or some other larger species. So certainly species could be an important issue and should be, particularly in electronic formats, a drop-down box as opposed to everyone putting in, writing in a narrative form what their particular species option ought to be. Secondly, does the IACUC need to know the source of the animals to conduct its review? Many of the IACUC administrator attendees argue no, the IACUC doesn't. There are approved vendors, and those are the ones that the veterinary staff will consider and will approve the institution, maybe based upon its medical health status, its surveillance status, maybe based upon prior interactions or regulatory information concerning that vendor. But does the IACUC need to know that? And no, the IACUC generally does not. So that could be something left off of the IACUC form, but yet captured in maybe the administrative area. Final disposition. Does the IACUC need to know the details of the disposition of the animals? Could we use a simple checkbox to say the animals will be euthanized according to the process described in the protocol, or transferred to another protocol, or released back into the wild, or maybe even euthanized by means of institutional approved SOPs, or potentially taking a book from Aubrey's calendar from maybe a CUSP item could be listed in there too. So ways to minimize the amount of narrative that researchers are being asked to write. Utilize checkboxes in existing documents that have already been considered and already approved. This area is one where there still is a fair amount of discussion continuing on exactly what should or should not be, what is necessary for the IACUC to have sufficient information to make an informed decision. We'll go then to a page on justification of animal use. Certainly there is a need for the IACUC to understand why animals are being done. We can all appreciate that each PI must explain why it's necessary to conduct the facilities. Bill, we're moving forward on our slides. Let's back up a little bit, please, to justification of animal use. The questions to help the committee understand the rationale of why the animals are being used and why a non-animal model are inappropriate are all very important and necessary for a committee to make an informed decision. You can see question 5 that has a red line through it. Please check yes to provide assurance that animal activities conducted in this protocol do not necessarily duplicate previously conducted activities. Is that necessary at this point? Is that necessary for the IACUC's consideration, or is that question one that can actually be captured in an administrative assessment of the proposal? We're moving on then to general animal activities, which has historically been defined as the experimental design. An important point of experimental design is that I think many IACUCs that I've observed and even participated with have a tendency to move into helping the researcher do their design of their study, which that action ought to really be occurring offline. The IACUC ought to understand the direction and purpose and focus, but in terms of designing the experiment, that really should be something done extra IACUC. The IACUC needs to understand the goal and the objective and how the animals would be used to prove that particular goal, that they have been scientifically justified. And sometimes we think the easiest mechanism to do that is to include the entire experimental design of the proposal, which becomes very wordy. For some researchers, may be somewhat of a cut and paste off of a grant if they've submitted. And for many of us, it really doesn't add substantially to understanding exactly what's being done. It doesn't add to providing additional information or knowledge that the IACUC would need to make an informed dissent. The premise of the overall discussion is that the committee can fulfill its obligations by reviewing the proposed animal activities without knowing specific details in the experimental design if the committee is able to ask the right questions. And what might right questions be? Well, question 1C is an example. Give a sequential description of procedures being conducted. Sequential description is a far more minor, more succinct, more summary approach to what's occurring than would be an experimental design. Another point might be question 1D and maybe 1E, even considering those together. Do those satisfy the regulatory requirement of assuring adequate numbers of animals? And if the answer is yes, then let's stay with the blue questions. If the answers are no, then maybe a text box might be required to have some additional argument as well. We'll continue then into the procedural section, things that often, again, get rather wordy: blood collection, euthanasia, behavioral studies. If there is any section of the protocol that can fit most nicely to the use of check boxes, or to the reference to approved institutional SOPs, or to the identification of particular CUSPs that have been previously approved for use at the institution, it would indeed be this section. The procedure questions gather information that the IACUC may need to answer questions such as flexibility specifics. One of our goals as committee members is to try to maximize flexibility within the approved practice. We don't wish to create unanticipated non-compliance for the PIs, which historically has been the case. We've all experienced that. As an example, the researcher might put on his protocol a specific reference to a specific amount of anesthetic, analgesic, or fluids, or any other device. And then if for whatever reason, maybe they use a different syringe size, they find the animal needs more or less, and they administer that, they have completed an unanticipated non-compliance. So flexibility within the protocol, giving ranges, giving options, drawing blood quantities as long as total volumes are not exceeded, or as long as the frequency is within that already approved by the institution. Using standard language whenever possible. A large percent of rodent studies are euthanized by gas asphyxiation. This process is generally well documented at most institutions by an SOP. All the researcher needs to do is just confirm that they're going to use the institution's SOP for this particular practice, instead of having them write it out in detail. What frequently occurs, and we've seen it in many institutions, that every researcher was trained at a different place, and there were slightly different ways of doing that same procedure at their past institution. Or they may have historical bias where they've always done it that way before. So when we gather as a community at our home institution, it may be worthwhile for us to develop some commonality and consistency of processes. I know it breeds good compliance, and it encourages good animal welfare, and it encourages timely and efficient response if we can all do things the same kinds of ways. And so having those procedures which can just be checked and everyone agree to cuts down on the amount of information committee members must read, and could also increase the accuracy and the applicability of the protocols. Other places where similar kinds of things might also be effective could be in such things as blood collection. You see a couple of examples on the screen from the draft document how that could be applied. Up to 1% of the animal's body weight, and then as a parenthetical, 1 ml of blood for every 100 grams of body weight may be collected in 14 days or less. As long as they don't exceed that, then is there more that the committee must also worry with? Moving into the arena on survival surgery, the group that looked at this originally saw quite a few differences between institutions. Some go into quite a bit of requirement on how the instruments will be cleaned, not sterilized, but cleaned, and then follow that with the method of sterilization. If we're doing a good job with training, if our veterinary staff and our care staff are engaged with the researchers, if we have good SOPs on how we expect these things as an institution to do, then maybe indeed all we need is a short sort of compliance paragraph in the document that says, yes, I'm going to do all these things, and I'll use one of these options, for example, disinfectant with either betadine or chlorhexidine, or some other product that still achieves the outcome of a disinfected site. And then rinsing with products of choice, giving them options. And all the researcher has to do is check yes or no, and if no, then explain. Once again, it breeds consistency within the institution, it breeds commonality, and it breeds ease of monitoring and assuring people are completing the same kinds of things in the same general manner. When we look at minimizing pain or discomfort, once again, we're in an area where between institutions, the differences are substantial, and within institutions, the differences are substantial. But still, there are things where we can come to a commonality and a common understanding. For example, the application of sterile ophthalmic ointment to the eyes, since rodents have a tendency not to blink when under anesthesia, and they have a tendency not to tear well when under anesthesia. So instead of asking the question, playing cat and mouse, or maybe it's mouse and mouse, let's just put the statement down, have them check yes, they will do it, and move on forward. The same may also apply with thermal regulatory support of the animals during the anesthetic procedure. Probably one of the more common things institutions are challenged with is continuously monitoring animals over the entire anesthetic period. And having a simple statement that they will be monitored would potentially be important in a universal type document. I'll pause and momentarily comment with this particular thing. There are several of us who express some concern over words such as continuously. Continuously means observing all the time, continuously, as the word continuously means. And maybe what this really ought to read is something within every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, what would be appropriate within the institution and approved by the veterinary staff. So things can be adjusted to be more appropriate, more medically practical, and to meet the needs of the local community. We have the same kinds of issues that develop in anesthetic and analgesic use. Once again, every researcher will have their own choices, their own biases, their own experiential knowledge, but all institutions have a veterinary staff that are hopefully engaged and have a fair formulary or a good set of outline, or maybe some recommended drugs and dosages that could be used or should be used as a default across the institution, particularly for a specific species having general kinds or common kinds of procedures done to them. This slide is just an example. Indeed, one could place anything you wished up there in terms of anesthetic, but the point is simply give them something to check so that we all know what we're all going to be using, and then they can reference SOPs in terms of technical procedures, or maybe request training from the veterinary unit in terms of specific application of the expected outcomes of the use of particular medications for anesthesia. The same applies on the next slide. We see the same kinds of connotations with the use of analgesics. When they are applied, how they are applied, and the ranges that would be appropriate for application. Don't do the cat and mouse question and answer guessing game. Let them know what the options are and let them choose door number 1, 2, 3, or if there's another, they can request some deviation from that, or maybe the addition of another analgesic regimen. Things do change on occasion. Some drugs become more in favor. Sometimes they will indeed fall out of favor. So that's not meant to be categoric and never shift. One of the challenges we have is trying to stay with the times and stay with the needs and include flexibility in our protocol design and presentation, as well as the research community. Bill noted in the last of his comments, an area that's currently under consideration by the group is the one on hazardous agents. It's not the IACUC's role to assess hazard agent use. There's generally another committee or a safety officer or groups of officers that do that action on campus. The protocol template might capture what the specific agent was, and then that could be turfed off to the IBC or other safety groups to evaluate whether that agent is being stored properly, used properly, cleaned properly, and disposed of properly. What the IACUC needs is confirmation that people working in those spaces are not going to be placed at hazard due to the use of that particular agent. And that's really what the safety person ought to be doing. We are aware that for many, probably most IACUCs these days, there is a safety individual or someone that serves on the IACUC and the IBC. And the IACUC administrators, attendees felt that was a very favorable kind of thing. But the next step might be to shift all the safety discussions out of the IACUC meeting into a safety community with just a concurrence memo, or we've solved this, or we're working with PI or something, so that the IACUC can focus on the issues that are most critically important, the health and the well-being of the research subject, and then the safety of that particular workspace. Colleagues, this gives you an overview of the UPT. It is much broader and wider than we've got time to discuss today. That would be a multi-hour discussion in of itself, but we've gone ahead and made our journey now into the questions and thought portions. I'll turn it back over to Bill and let him continue with this.
Thank you, Ron. So we have just a couple of minutes for some questions. If you submit more that we can't get to, then FTP Lillian said she would post them on the website or post them and make them available. We can answer others. But does anyone have any questions for us, particular about the UPT, or more questions for Aubrey about CUSP? Again, use the chat line to communicate. Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anything, so I will turn it back to Lillian, and she will bring us to closure. So Lillian?